I'm April Baldwin. I am a senior history major who is currently enrolled in the spring 2015 Section 1 class of Social Work 300. And I am here to present my Louisiana Slave Database information. So the Louisiana Slave Database is really a database that talks about the different factors of enslavement that people were subjected to in Louisiana. The information was found in one of the parish courthouses by Dr. Gwendolyn Hall in the late 1980s, and she took all this information, which was a compilation of lots and lots of different and extensive records kept by French and Spanish slave owners and people who were actually a part of that slave trade when they were in business in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So this slave database covers the span of years. It actually has information from when the Spanish were the main colonizers in Louisiana, and then when it changed over to French rule, and then when it changed over to American rule, which of course was the English. And it is said that the French and the Spanish practitioners actually kept a lot more clean records than the British. So there are a lot more of the records that had to be translated from English, what had to be translated into English from French and Spanish in order for the database to be read and made. So what Dr. Hall did was she compiled all of this information, separated very different variables. So you get including names, their locations, dates of death, languages that they spoke, and a lot of different other factors and variables of the slave trade in Louisiana. So the factors that I chose to focus on for my particular presentation were the ethnic groups of the Africans in Louisiana. I also focused on the origins of the people in Louisiana, and I focused on the native languages of those who were enslaved in Louisiana. Now, the reason I picked these three is that I felt that they were the three that kind of coincided the best. They kind of gave you an overall view of the data that was collected, just mainly from the African perspective. So I'm going to get into kind of talking about it. So I started with the origins of the enslaved people because unbeknownst to me, as well as other people, there was a lot more Africans, or there were more races, should I say, or people from other places besides Africa that were actually a part of the slave trade in Louisiana. So most of the people who were enslaved in Africa or enslaved in Louisiana, were not able to be identified from their place of origin. It said that, 91% of the people who were 62% of the people who were enslaved could not identify their origins. And these were the people who either their masters didn't want them to tell, they didn't know where they came from. Could have been a lot of different factors that led to them not being able to identify their place of origin. So that's the vast majority of the 100,666 participants that were used in this study. Now, the largest place where most of the people who were able to identify their places of origin came from Africa. About 24% were from there, whereas about 10% were from the Creole areas. The next thing that I chose to focus on is to kind of take that 24% and enlarge it. So of the 24%, right, we're going with the 24% of those who were able to identify their origins. They were asked which ethnic group they were part of. At this time in Africa, there were a lot of different kingdoms, a lot of different units, family groups that were around. So there were people like the Yoruba, the Igbo over in Nigeria and Kenya. There were the Asante and a lot of different other tribal units over in West Africa. So here are just some of the few that ended up in Louisiana. Here, the largest delegation, the largest delegation of Africans who knew their ethnicity was from Congo. About 3,000 of the people who were able to identify their ethnic origins were from the Congo area. And this is another area where there was a large percentage of the people who weren't able to identify what their ethnicity was. About 91% weren't able to identify their ethnicity. So the Congo region is the region that produced the most. And then the second most is the Mandinga. There's a small faction of the Igbo, Hausa, and Yoruba who are represented in this group in Louisiana, but that's not limited to how much or how many people with these same ethnicities or more were part of the slave trade in Louisiana. And that's not to say that different ethnic groups weren't in more prominent numbers elsewhere, for instance, in Alabama or in South Carolina. And the last chart that I want to display was the native languages of those Africans, their origin languages. And it's just another demographic to show how different it was for Africans who were coming from slavery, or coming into slavery, how different it was for them to adjust to a life of servitude, and also a life around a lot of different people that they would not have associated with when they were in Africa. The main language that was spoken, or the language that had the most constituents, I would say, is going to be the Benue Congo region, and that is about... There is about 3% of that population that was able to identify, because again, remember, about 91% of the people of the records that were found and the people who were able to identify their native languages, just as with the ethnic groups, were not able to identify from where they came. So we're only left with about 9% to kind of work with. So the biggest faction came from the Benue Congo language, and 2% spoke Mande. There's another language in here, Kwa and Gore, or Gebe, and there's a lot of other different languages that were spoken. Again, this does not limit the amount of people who could have spoken another language in another section of the country. So this is pretty much my interpretation of the Louisiana Slave Database. And what I really liked about this project was the fact that you really got a chance to get into the raw data, which is not something that you see. As a history major, I hear a lot of narratives about slavery, about the slave trade. I don't see a lot of empirical data as I did with working with the Louisiana Slave Database. So this was a really, really great opportunity for me, one, to get a different perspective and a different way to research slavery, and that's different from anything that I've ever done before. So this was a really, really great project. I'm actually very excited that I did. I'm going to use this later on, probably if I go to grad school. It's a great resource to use, and it does nothing but prove that slavery was a business. They have sales records, anything that you can think of, prices, mean prices, average prices. This was a business for the United States, and this was how the country was founded. So here is my interpretation for the Louisiana Slave Database. Thank you for listening.